Almost everyone has heard of the space race, but what exactly does this phrase entail, and how does it relate to not only the United States history, but the world? To get started, here's a quick overview of the causation and overarching theme of this historical event. The space race stretched for roughly 20 years, ranging from 1957 to 1975. The main countries involved were the United States and the formerly known Soviet Union, which is present-day Russia. The race stemmed from post-World War II tension, where both the USA and USSR realized the importance of developing rockets. Both countries agreed advanced rocket research would provoke a prominent military force, and so the ever-so-technological space race commenced. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet space race program quickly captured the lead, ahead of the United States, by launching Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 was the first Earth satellite in history. The satellite was the size of a basketball and weighed approximately 180 pounds. It also traveled at 18,000 miles per hour, 500 miles above the Earth's surface, and orbited every 98 minutes, flying over the United States 7 times a day. Furthermore, right after Sputnik's 1 launch, the USSR sent another rocket into orbit named Sputnik 2. This time, the orbiter had a live dog aboard the module named Laika, but unfortunately it ended up perishing in space after only a few hours. However, due to the Soviets' rapid success in space, America became very alarmed, worrying about the technological innovations that the Soviets might contrive for their military, as well as worrying about being attacked by missiles from space. This prompted the United States in 1958 to pass the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which created NASA. In paranoid response to the USSR, NASA launched Explorer 1 into Earth's orbit. Explorer 1 actually proved scientifically successful since it carried scientific equipment that led to the discovery of the Van Allen radiation belt. This belt facilitates the sun's radiation from not damaging Earth's surface dramatically. Anyways, back to the race. 2 months after Explorer 1 was launched, the USSR claimed another advance when the United States failed to launch Explorer 2 successfully due to a faulty rocket booster. Meanwhile, the USSR continued to send positive missions into space, sending Sputnik 3, which was an automatic scientific laboratory spacecraft. It provided data on pressure and composition of the upper atmosphere, concentration of charged particles, photons and cosmic rays, heavy nuclei and cosmic rays, and magnetic and electrostatic fields in the atmosphere. Sputnik 3 really highlighted the Soviets' yearning to gain more scientific knowledge about the space surrounding Earth. These research statistics were setting up the USSR to develop more missions and to eventually militarize space. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union started to create the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System that after launch would go into a low Earth orbit and would then deorbit for an attack. It had no range limit and the orbital flight path would not reveal the target location. This would allow a path to North America over the South Pole, hitting targets from the south, which is the opposite direction America's early warning systems were orientated. In response, NASA launched the Discovery XIV, which embodied the first camera-equipped spy satellite on August 18, 1960. This United States launch symbolizes the feeling of America's public during this time period. They were deeply paranoid about Soviet bombings. Furthermore, 1961 was a revolutionary year within the space race because the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, was inaugurated into office, offering a spark within America's space division. At the same time, the USSR accomplished an unbelievable feat on April 12th by sending the first man ever into space. Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth once during his flight. The United States was right behind the Soviets' tails, as only a mere 3 weeks later, NASA flew the first American into space, Alan Shepard. Moreover, a few days later, President John F. Kennedy addressed the United States Congress and challenged the nation to go to the moon before the end of the decade. The moon stood as the next prize, and President Kennedy offered the Soviets first glance at defeat. Since America was slightly embarrassed by the USSR at the beginning of the space race, the USA took the next few years very seriously, spawning the Apollo program. The Apollo program eventually propelled the United States to landing Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins on the moon on July 20, 1969. This historic achievement officially placed the previously tailing USA into the lead of the space race. For the next 6 years, space missions increasingly declined, and as relations between the Soviet Union and the United States became more civil, so did the decade-long space race. In July of 1975, the first U.S.-Soviet joint mission occurred with the Apollo-Soyuz project. This mission carried 3 U.S. astronauts and 2 Soviet cosmonauts, who exchanged their country's flags as a symbol of the first international manned space venture. This officially marked the end of the space race. Now, you may be wondering why or how did the Soviet Union ultimately end up losing the space race? Everyone was aware that whoever accomplished placing men on the moon would consequently win the race. So how did the USSR fall short since they developed such a strong program in the beginning of the space race in the late 1950s and early 60s? The answer lies within a combination of aspects, which were the lack of funding, leadership, and organization in the USSR's program. NASA obtained more funding than the Soviets, and the U.S. space program spent roughly $23 billion on manned programs from 1961 through the first lunar landing in July of 1969, but Soviet manned programs only ranged from $4.8 billion to $10.1 billion, which is less than 50% of NASA's budget. Moreover, although President John F. Kennedy died in 1963, the Soviets faced a detrimental death as well. Sergei Pavlovich-Korolev, the chief designer and mastermind between the USSR's space efforts, died in 1966. The Soviet Union was unable to replace the drive, leadership, and political expertise Korolev brought to the space program. In addition, Korolev's successor enacted unproductive organization techniques. The United States had a single moon program with a unified set of goals, while the USSR had multiple sections of their space operations. Instead of consolidating limited resources under a single operation, the USSR created 2 separate systems. They had one for landing people on the lunar surface and one for sending people around the moon. This greatly disabled the effectiveness of their space program since each system had different codes, mechanisms, and vehicles they were engineering. This greatly disabled the effectiveness of their space program since each system had different codes, mechanisms, and vehicles they were engineering. Sergei Khrushchev, the son of former Premier Nikita Khrushchev of Russia during the beginning of the Cold War, elaborated on why he thought the USSR lost the space race. Khrushchev states, "The Russians were not pretty close to sending the cosmonauts to the moon. I think Russia had no chance to be ahead of the Americans." He also reiterates how, when talking about the Russian program, there is a misconception in the West that it was centralized. In reality, it was more decentralized than the United States, which had one focused Apollo program. In the Soviet Union, there were different designers who competed with each other. Overall, multiple variables correlated together to hinder the Soviets' advancement and victory in the space race. But the space race proves itself as an influential part of history, as it increased the world's appreciation of space, validated the United States as the leader in cosmic exploration, and kick-started civil relations between Cold War enemies.